So happy that you're going to be talking to us tonight about resilient landscapes. Really excited about it. And before you begin, let me just give people a little bit about your background. So Mimi was born and raised in the Bay Area and spent many happy days as a child exploring the Santa Cruz Mountains. Lucky you. You worked in the technology industry for 17 years before moving to Sonoma County in 2000 to pursue your passion as a landscape designer. You completed training to become a UC Master Gardener in 2011 because of your interest in helping educate Sonoma County residents on the topic of sustainable landscaping. And then you completed your sustainable MBA with a concentration in food systems a couple of years later in 2014. You're now at the University of California Cooperative Extension, Sonoma County. You've been there since 2013 in a dual role as both the Master Gardener Program Coordinator and Program Manager, focusing on community-based food systems with a particular focus on reducing food waste and increasing food recovery. So thank you for all of that great work that you're doing for the residents of Sonoma County. And with that, I'll turn it over to you for our webinar tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shannon, for the introduction. I really appreciate it. First, I want to thank Sonoma Land Trust for inviting the UC Master Gardener program here in Sonoma County to be part of your ongoing Language of the Land series. We've been very excited to join you in our educational outreach mission in partnership with you. And I want to say this is the first time that I've been translated simultaneously into Spanish. And I'm going to try very hard to speak slowly enough so our translator can keep up with me. I usually talk at a very fast speed. So hopefully many of you are familiar with the Master Gardener program and who we are and what we do. We are trained agents of the University of California, extending educational outreach to residents of Sonoma County on home horticulture and sustainable landscape practices. But tonight, I'm here to talk to you about work we've been doing since the 2017 wildfires, helping educate our communities on what we call a sustainable defensible space or resilient landscapes. So in today's talk, I'm going to cover a number of topics. I'm going to start out with giving you some background on the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, as well as our principles of sustainable defensible space. Then I'm going to briefly touch on the concept of landscape ecosystem services, and then move into discussing possible fire exposures that we can experience, and then take you through some basics of defensible space principles, and then wrap up with some resources. So after the 2017 wildfires, our Master Gardener program really did a deep dive to educate ourselves on the topic of defensible space. Then in 2019, we were starting to explore some tensions between what we recommend for sustainable landscaping, such as mulch use for water conservation and tree placement for energy conservation. And we were seeing tensions with those suggestions and recommendations and defensible space recommendations. At that very fortuitous time, we happened to connect with two other local nonprofits who were starting to grapple with the same issue. And those nonprofits are Habitat Corridor Project, a California Native Plant Advocacy nonprofit, and the Sonoma Ecology Center. And out of our discussions, we formed what we call the Resilient Landscapes Coalition. And then we partnered up with Fire Safe Sonoma. So we sought to balance what we saw to be competing demands for energy and water conservation with defense against fire and support for wildlife in our gardens. We then spent some extensive time reviewing and developing our content and sharing it with local fire officials so we can ensure that we were all on the same page at the same time educating them on the importance of sustainable landscaping principles. So there's a really wide array of outreach being conducted by the Resilient Landscapes Coalition. And being part of a multi-organization partnership like this really broadens the scope of what we could each do as individual organizations. Our Master Gardener program participation is focused on residential community outreach. And we also serve as the scientific advisor with advisors in our program for content development. Our partners work in this same area, but also do educational outreach to landscape professionals and fire professionals. And they also design and install demonstration gardens, primarily focusing on fire stations for the demo garden locations. We have recorded many of our community workshops, as well as developed 3 separate videos on various topics regarding defensible space. And the team has also developed a standalone website. And I'll be happy to share links to these with you at the end of my presentation. Of course, we still maintain our own content on our Sonoma County Master Gardener website. So there are a lot of online resources that are available to help guard your work as you work to make your home landscapes and your homes better prepared for future wildfires. Just wanted to pause to give our translator a moment to catch up. So our home landscapes provide critical ecosystem services. Fear of the threat of future wildfires may compel some people to think that they have to remove all of their landscaping. And we advocate that you don't have to create a moonscape to be prepared for future wildfires. Our landscapes provide critical support for wildlife and biodiversity, can help us manage and retain stormwater on our properties, sequester carbon, and support pollinators amongst many other important services. So I want to briefly focus on the importance of supporting biodiversity in our landscapes. And biodiversity, very basically, is the web of life above and below the ground. Optimally, to support biodiversity, you want to choose native plant species. And the recommendation is to perhaps do at least 70 to 80% of your plantings in your garden in native species. We know everybody has their favorite plant from their grandmother's camellia or their mother's roses. So we see that there needs to be a balance between non-native and native plants in our home landscapes. Native plants improve biodiversity by providing food, by fruits, seeds, leaves, and insects to wildlife. And these interrelationships have co-evolved over millennia. I want to highlight in particular the importance of oak trees. They are known as a keystone species because they're incredibly productive food factories for wildlife. And I want to point out that they provide acorns and host the insects and caterpillars. It's not just the acorns that are providing the food for wildlife, but it's also leaves, bark, many other aspects of the oak tree that are helping sustain our local flora and our local fauna. Though not just for the birds, acorns also feed over 100 vertebrate species, including squirrels and deer. And many insect species feed on the leaves, twigs, and bark and wood of the oak trees. Optimally, you want to plant groups of plantings, and this is something that's a recommendation in defensible space as well, to provide wildlife food as well as shelter. We advocate for using the least toxic approach in managing your landscape, which is called integrated pest management, and suggest that you learn to tolerate any damage, say from insects in your plants. And if you feel like you have to address a pest infestation, to use the least toxic approaches to managing that. And it's also very important to provide a water source for wildlife. So giving Christina a pause gives me a pause for taking some tea. So thank you, Christina. We'll try to work that out in partnership. So let's dive into the basics of fire and some core principles behind defensible space education. Hopefully, you're all familiar with the fire triangle. And fire requires three components, and those are oxygen, heat, and fuel. And of course, the only component that we can manage is fuel. So a step beyond the fire triangle concept, fire behavior is made up of fuel, weather, and topography. And again, the primary component that we can manage is fuel. And fuel, very basically, is anything that's organic that will burn. And here I've listed some examples of possible fuel in our home landscapes. So we all need to think about what our goals are in preparing for the next fire. And very importantly, this should include firefighter safety and access for them if you're lucky enough to have a fire engine on your property during a wildfire. But it's also incredibly important to think about your family safety as well as your structure safety and what your priorities are in preparing for a future wildfire. So California has been a leader in fire preparedness. This slide, though a little overwhelming with all the text, gives a sense for California legislation around fire preparedness over the last 6 decades. Interesting to note that vegetation management legislation was originally created in 1965. And it was in 2005 that defensible space as a concept was expanded to 100 feet surrounding structures based on scientific research. Also want to point out that Zone 0, a concept I'm going to describe to you in just a few slides, was legislated in 2020. And state legislators mandated it in 2020 via AB 3074, but we're still waiting for the guidelines from the state of what will and won't be allowed in Zone 0. So it hasn't been fully implemented yet, but it doesn't mean we can't all be getting prepared for when that legislation is enacted. So there are multiple types of fire exposure, and we certainly have experienced both average as well as extreme fire conditions in Sonoma County, and we know what that experience is like. But I'm going to take you through some more detail about the type of fire we should prepare for based on these potential fire exposures and threats. So classically, defensible space recommendations were focused on direct flame contact as an exposure. That's depicted here on the left of this slide. What's newer information for us is how we prepare for a possible ember exposure or radiant heat exposure. And each of these takes a slightly different approach. And I want to point out that wind-blown embers are responsible for the majority of building ignitions, and that's part of that connection with why the state of California mandated Zone 0. So again, classically, we only discuss defensible space in the context of direct flame exposure as a way to interrupt fire pathways. Ember defense, however, involves coupling a concept called home hardening along with defensible space, especially that newer Zone 0, which I'll explain shortly, to reduce your exposure to embers. And radiant heat exposure is mitigated through home hardening and fuel reduction, which speaks to adjacent structure placement and proximity, which is illustrated here by this burning shed in proximity to the home. Okay, so let's move into the defensible space. Here are the most basic principles for defensible space. You want to start at your house and work out from there. And that means your first priority is following any recommendations for home hardening. There's lots of great resources and information available, including on our websites, to help support you in that work. You want to continuously be removing all dead or dying plants and branches. You want to remove what's called ladder fuels, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. The recommendation is to create islands of plantings with non-combustible pathways between them to interrupt the path of fire to your home and structures. You want to avoid planting or mulching close to structures. Maintenance is really very essential to, we can't just do all the work once to create our defensible space and think we're done. Ongoing maintenance is critical for continuing to maintain your defensible space. And we suggest you use science to inform your decisions. Much of the information I'm presenting tonight is science-based, but research is ongoing, and I'm excited to share some information with you about some ongoing research that we hope to hear about very shortly. So an important component of defensible space is something called horizontal and vertical spacing. This visual on the left depicts suggested horizontal spacing guidelines for groupings of plants and also shows how that spacing should be increased based on the degree of slope. So for a flat or less than 20% slope, as depicted in this top visual, the recommendation is to have spacing 2 times the height of the plants on the outside of these plant groupings. So if the outside shrubs are, for example, 2 feet high, then you would want to have 4 feet of spacing between your plant groupings. And then, of course, due to fire transmission on slopes, that plant grouping separation increases with the degree of slope. For vertical spacing, which is depicted here on the right, you want a minimum of 6 feet from the ground plane to the lowest tree limbs. If you have smaller trees, you would want to consider 1/3 the height of the tree for clearance. So if you have a 12-foot high tree, then you want to ensure you have 4 feet of vertical spacing from the ground, and then maintain your vertical spacing as the tree grows. And then again, hopefully you're all familiar with the concept of ladder fuels. We've got that depicted here on the right. The goal is to reduce the possibility of having fire move from the ground plane into the crown of the trees. We really want to avoid that at all costs. So you want to remove any shrubs below trees. And if you do have a shrub under a tree, you want to make sure that you have at least 3 times the height of that shrub at the top between it and the lowest tree limb. So revisiting horizontal spacing guidelines and including now proposed tree spacing. These are CAL FIRE recommendations for plant spacing guidelines within 100 feet of your home, so your defensible space zone. But I want to stress that these are not mandated by law. Spacing between grasses, shrubs, and trees is really crucial to reduce the spread of wildfires. It is suggested that you can include low-growing, well-irrigated grasses, ground covers, or perennials between these tree or plant groupings. But each of us needs to assess our overall risk with the degree of slope and fire risk in terms of what type of fire severity zone we live in to make appropriate decisions in our own home landscapes. So it's recommended for less than 20% of a slope that you have 10-foot spacing between the crowns of the trees. And then again, that spacing increases given the degree of the slope. So there are no set guidelines concerning plant spacing. These are best recommendations based on firefighters' experiences, candidly. This graphic is from the National Fire Protection Association, and they actually suggest wider spacing between trees in closer proximity to your structures. So you can see here in your 5 to 30-foot zone, they're recommending 18-foot spacing between trees, individual trees, or small groups of trees. And then that spacing decreases as you move further out away from the structures. So here in your 30 to 60 feet zone, it's suggesting 12 feet spacing, and then that you can go down to as low as 6-foot spacing beyond that in 60 to 100 feet. But again, you need to make your own judgments based on your own fire risk on your property. So there's no such thing as fire-resistant landscaping. And the University of California does not advocate for fire-resistant plant lists, though people are often asking for them. The reality is that all plants can burn. And we believe it's much more important to consider where you place a plant in your landscape and then how you maintain it moving forward. You want to choose plants that will grow to a size appropriate for their location. And you want to locate those plants where excess pruning is not required to maintain desired spacing. The recommendation is to select low-growing, open-structured, less resinous, and higher moisture content plants. And there are certainly many options available, but it's not mandated. It's about how you plant it, where you plant it, and then how you maintain it moving forward. Okay, let's dive into the 3 defensible space zones. It's important to note again that you want to start from your house and you want to start with your home hardening and then work out from there through the 3 defensible space zones, which are termed Zone 0, Zone 1, and Zone 2. So as I mentioned in an earlier slide, Zone 0 is a relatively newer zone introduced into defensible space recommendations due to embers. So it's also known as the Ember Defense Zone. I want to stress that this zone is recommended and supported by scientific research. Zone 0, implementing Zone 0 in your properties, reduces the likelihood of structure ignition by reducing the potential for direct ignition of the structure from flame content by embers that could accumulate at the base of a wall and or indirect ignition when embers ignite vegetation or other combustible materials located close to the structure. That then results in either a radiant heat and or a direct flame contact exposure to the structure. Zone 0 is the horizontal area within the first 5 feet around any structure and outbuildings and attached decks on your property. And this includes stairs. The zone also includes the area under attached decks and stair landings. And to be most effective, the zone should incorporate a 6-inch vertical area between the ground and the start of the building's exterior siding. So let's start with embers. This picture is a really fantastic depiction of what can be occurring during a wildfire. And what's particularly interesting is if you look at how the embers are moving throughout this space and swirling around in this space. You can see that higher risk areas are areas like this alcove area in the structure. And what's interesting to note here is that this firefighter is having to fight flames in the 0 to 5 foot zone because there's vegetation in that area that's ignited due to these embers. So this is really good context for when we discuss Zone 0 recommendations in the next slide. So we want to reduce the chance of wind-blown embers from a fire landing near the home and igniting combustible materials and transmitting that fire to the structure. This zone is closest to the house, so it requires the most careful selection and management of vegetation and other possible fuels. Classically, we've massed shrubs against the house, foundation shrubs. So this is a big shift away from how we have traditionally designed our home landscapes. But we need to think about the fuel this generates for fire in immediate proximity to a structure. Optimally, you should have no vegetation or combustible materials in this zone. At a minimum, you want to remove or minimize planting in more vulnerable places where fire could enter your home, such as under windows, under vents and eaves, or combustible siding and under or near decks. No fences or wood gates should be attached to your house, as they can directly move fire to your home. And I've got some pictures to depict that for you in a few slides. This also applies to hedges. Optimally, this zone will be used for hardscape, such as gravel or concrete pathways, especially if you're in a high or a very high fire severity zone. If you absolutely must use plants in this zone, the recommendation is to use low perennial or succulent plants, and then to maintain them meticulously to ensure that you're regularly removing dead plant materials. As I mentioned previously, there is new state of California legislation coming that will mandate this zone. So it'd be great if you could get on top of this and implement this in your own property, especially if you're in high fire or very high fire severity zone. We aren't suggesting you have to remove trees if you're in zone 0, in your zone 0. Trees provide important shade during the summer to reduce energy needs inside your home. The most important aspect to consider with trees closer to your home is what debris they drop that you then need to maintain on your roof and in the zones immediately around your structures. It can make your maintenance easier if you remove any limbs within 5 feet of your roof. And you want to make sure you prune all tree limbs that are 10 feet from a chimney or a stovepipe outlet. And that's a Sonoma County code requirement. During a red flag warning day, or if you have time to evacuate from your house due to a fire, if you have time, clean up any debris in this zone around your structures and on your roof. And you want to make sure you're removing that litter from your roof and gutters regularly. Let's move on to zone 1, the 5 to 30 foot zone around your homes and structures on your property. This is commonly referred to as the home defense zone. This is typically where firefighters will be staged when defending your home, so it's incredibly important to consider their access to defend your home. Your focus in this zone is to modify the fuels and create a discontinuity between planting groups, to limit the pathways for fire to burn to the structure, and to reduce the potential for near to building ember generation and radiant heat exposures. The recommendation for this zone is to plant in islands of plantings that are separated by pathways or breaks between those plantings. In a higher risk area, you might want to consider making those pathways non-combustible, such as gravel or stepping stones. Again, the goal is to interrupt the flow of fire to your home. Plantings in this zone should optimally be non-woody and 3 feet in height or less. You can consider inclusion of a specimen or a single tree or shrub rather than masses in this zone. You want to ensure that all plants are accessible for regular maintenance, as you want to keep all plants clear of dead material. Keep an eye on your vertical and your horizontal spacing. And then we'll discuss mulch. Mulch is acceptable in this zone. We'll discuss mulch in much more depth later. But it's great. This is a great zone for hardscapes such as patios. In zone 2, the 30 to 100 foot zone around your homes and structures on your property, which is called the reduced fuel zone, we have the same basic principles as we did in the 5 to 30 foot zone. But you can include shrubs and trees in widely spaced groups. These vegetation modification requirements are more significant for those properties with steeper terrain, larger and denser fuels, highly volatile fuels, and areas subject to frequent fires. Additional benefits of Zone 2 include facilitating direct defense actions by firefighters and improving the function of Zones 0 and 1 by reducing flame heights and the potential for ember generation and radiant heat exposure to structures. You want to continue the focus on creating islands of vegetation. Ensure you have easy access for maintenance, and wider pathways can certainly help facilitate that access. And continue your vigilance on ladder fuel removal and regularly removing dead plant material. It is a Sonoma County code requirement that all annual grasses must be mowed to 4 inches in height during fire season. And you want to move any wood piles during fire season to this zone with nothing combustible located near the pile. So post-fire research also highlights that the fire pathway that a fence connected to a house can provide. So the red arrows in these pictures are depicting where there was a fence connected to these homes, a wooden fence. This was in the wildfire. I think it was in December, I can't remember which year, in Colorado. But you can see how the fire traveled along the fence line up to the structure. And again, you're seeing that same depiction in this picture here on the right. So very important to not have fences or wooden gates connected directly to your house. The recommendation is for metal gate connection rather than wood to the structure. And in this experiment, you can see that there's rock mulch. So they have the zone 0 implementation with rock mulch here, and that this metal gate and that rock mulch help prevent the fire spreading from this wooden fence. And with it had some wood mulch at the base of it that transmitted the fire to the fence. You can see how this rock mulch and metal gate have stopped the transmission of the fire to the building. You want to consider doing the bulk of your vegetation management from September to February so you avoid bird nesting season, which runs from March to August. And you want to be sensitive to possible ground nesting birds when you are mowing annual grasses. And remember that we share this space with other life. So a layer of mulch helps with weed suppression and water conservation. So it's a very important aspect of a sustainable landscape. Since wood mulches are organic and as such combustible materials, which can transmit fire, it's recommended not to use mulch in a widespread or a continuous manner. You want to separate areas, planting areas, mulched with these materials with non-combustible and ignition-resistant materials, such as concrete, gravel, rock, or even a native grass lawn or strip. Composted wood chips, there was a study done in 2008 by the University of Nevada at Reno and the University of California. And that was the most recent mulch flammability study that's been conducted. I'm really excited. I was just hearing an update last night about a new research that's being conducted by UC Cooperative Extension in Marin County on mulch combustibility. They don't have the final results out yet, but very excited and looking forward to new recommendations that might be some slight changes in what we've been suggesting to folks so far. That it's very clear that you shouldn't use gorilla hair or shredded bark mulch. Embers can land in those type of materials and smolder, and if firefighters have moved on to another property, that could ignite and restart fire exposure for your home. Again, I want to stress you don't want to have any organic mulch within 0 to 5 feet of any house, your house, or any structures. And you want to focus on separating mulched areas with non-combustible materials. So I want to point out what's wrong with this picture. This isn't a good example. This is showing a shredded redwood bark mulch that's used in a continuous manner, butting up right against a long, looks like a juniper hedge that's moving, looks like it's connecting closely up to this house that's likely unirrigated and unmaintained. And this mulch will likely ignite that hedge on fire during a wildfire. So ongoing maintenance, as I mentioned, is essential for our fire-wise landscapes and resilient landscapes. You want to remove dead or dying branches from trees and shrubs regularly. Again, you want to mow your annual grasses and weeds to 4 inches tall or less. You want to prune out any dead material from the interior of shrubs. And you want to remove any ladder fuels and prioritize removing any, of course, planted directly under trees. And you want to thin and reduce your tree canopies every few years. So here's a design recap of the defensible space zones. Again, your 0 to 5 foot zone, your zone 0. You want to have no organic materials if possible. You want to focus on using inorganic materials such as gravel or stepping stones or concrete in that zone. In your 5 to 30 foot zone or zone 1, you want to focus on planting your plants in islands or groupings of plants. And if optimally with materials that are less than 3 feet in height. And materials such as low herbaceous perennials, grasses, or succulents. And then you can use some individual shrubs or trees. And then the same basic principles in zone 2, your 30 to 100 foot zone around your structures. But you can include more shrub and tree groupings in widely spaced groups, separated by areas that break up the spread of wildfire. It's also important to ensure that you, your family, and firefighters have clear access in and out of your property. It's the same basic principles. We want to make sure we're maintaining vegetation, though, on both sides of the roads and driveway. 10 feet in from the road edge and then 15 feet vertically. And you want to make sure that you have 12 feet of unobstructed pavement for passage of vehicles. So what could you do to make this driveway more fire safe? Of course, you want to cut that grass to 4 inches. You want to limb up these trees so you've got that 15-foot vertical clearance, and clean up, generally kind of clean up this heavy mass of greenery on the sides of the property. So you've got that 10-foot spacing. I think that's a better depiction down here. So you've got 10 feet off of the driveway for access and egress of vehicles. If you reside in a more densely forested area, you can control fire behavior by reducing ladder fuels, opening up the canopy, and maintaining your ground fuels. It certainly will help firefighters with fire suppression during a fire. Because new vegetation will regenerate in these areas, re-entry into these stands for ongoing maintenance is necessary every few years. So it's incredibly important to work with your neighbors in preparing for future wildfire events. If you can create common spaces between homes to minimize fire risks, such as putting in low ground covers and rock mulches with widely spaced trees and shrubs, that's a great approach. It's also great if you can focus on creating habitat connectivity to support wildlife between the structures. And we have so many amazing opportunities here in Sonoma County to partner up with neighborhood groups, such as Coke groups and Firewise groups, and so many amazing local fire departments, fire safe councils, Firewise communities to partner up with to be better prepared on a neighborhood basis for future fire events. So I want to show you some of these principles in practice with some photos. We've been working really hard to take pictures illustrating these principles. There really were no pictures available when we started just 4 years ago. So I have a series of photos to share with you illustrating these practices. So here's a great example on the left of a great 0 to 5 zone implemented in combination with the 5 to 30 foot zone with this wide gravel crushed rocked patio over base rock. And really minimal plant materials and low plant materials in direct proximity to the home. Here's another great example on the right of this same property with extensive use of hardscape in the 0 to 5 and 5 to 30 foot zones. Here's some great examples up in the Bennett Valley community in Santa Rosa, some rebuilds after the 2017 wildfires. I'm showing you some beautiful depictions of native plants, mostly perennial, so all 3 feet or less in height. Great implementation with this rock pathway in the 0 to 5 foot zone. And then with flagstone pathway coming through here as you move into your 5 to 30. And with good depictions of some islands of plantings, especially in closer proximity to the home. Another great example, this is actually a native sod lawn. Unfortunately, that doesn't perform really super well in the summer. You have to be able to tolerate some of that browning, but great depiction of hardscape in your 0 to 5 foot zone, moving into your 5 to 30 foot zone, and then this irrigated native sod lawn here as well. There's lots of great examples for options for incorporating more hardscape into our landscapes. Some beautiful examples from, all these pictures are from designs from one of our Resilient Landscapes Coalition partners, April Owens with Habitat Corridor Project, showing you some great examples here on the left. 0 to 5 foot zone with rock and pebble with a small island planting with mostly perennial plantings. Here's another great depiction of creativity with how you can mix different hardscape materials to make it look more interesting. And lots of great options for making it more interesting. That this is a rock swale for retaining rainwater during the rainy season. So another great creative way to introduce more hardscape into our landscapes, but still have some balance with some landscape. Some more examples of principles and practice. This is a great smaller garden that April did, showing you the plants laid out. Again, mostly all perennial plant materials. These are all wonderful native plant materials. Not as well depicted here, but there's hardscape with a walkway and a small patio. And then islands of plantings separated by the hardscape around the perimeter. And a great example in the 30 to 100 foot zone of pathways, inexpensive pathway options with crushed rock, separating your planted areas. Sorry, a little too fast there. So lots of great creative ways to introduce those fire breaks, those ways to break up the flow of fire with hardscape introduction in your home landscapes. A rebuild in Fountain Grove, showing you again, hardscape with that gravel in the 0 to 5 foot zone around the house. Another pathway here, gravel pathway here. So you've got an island of planting here separated by hardscape to break up that flow of fire. Another great example, classic concrete in the 0 to 5 with rock mulch around some planting areas in the 5 to 30. Another beautiful rebuild of a landscape that was redone by April in the Bennett Valley area. Another great example here on the left, an island of planting. You see the gravel in the 0 to 5 foot zone, another gravel path here, clearly defining this, this island with some separated by hardscape. And then moving out with some higher perennial grasses out beyond that in the 5 to 30 and 30 to 100 foot zone. And another example here from the Oakmont area. They have included some plant materials, but very minimally in the 0 to 5 foot zone, and then would be regularly maintaining that to make sure that it's healthy and is clear of any dead debris. Last photo showing you a shaded field break example, also from Bennett Valley. You can see the great work that this homeowner has done to reduce any woody brush around the base of the trees to create some good separation between the trees and keeping those grasses, especially during fire season, mowed to 4 inches or less. At this point, I imagine Christina must be exhausted from nonstop translating. I wanted to close up by sharing some resources with you all. I will put these in the chat when I stop screen sharing. Again, as I mentioned earlier, a wide array of website resources between the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, UC Agricultural and Natural Resources, which the Master Gardeners are part of, the Master Gardeners, fire safety organizations such as disastersafety.org, lots of great scientific publications from the University of California to help support the work we're doing and the recommendations that are made, and tons of great videos. So many great resources to help you beyond this workshop.